Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight to this webinar, which is an introduction to GP supervision roles, responsibilities and rewards. My name is Glenn Wallace. I'm CEO of GP Supervisors Australia, and joined with me tonight is Simon Morgan and Tony Solstice. Tony has been a GP supervisor for 30 years and has been involved in GP training for 15. Simon has been around the GP supervisor training webinar series for quite some time, has been a medical educator based in New South Wales, Newcastle, has been working for GP Synergy, currently working for Medcast and doing work for GPSA. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this meeting is taking place around the various points of this beautiful country, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and their families. We'd like to acknowledge the fact that their country was never ceded, never was and never will be, and reaffirm our commitment to reconciliation takes action. GPSA has committed to a reconciliation action plan this year, so we'll be working towards that this and next year. This is the first in a series of webinars introducing supervision for new supervisors. So you may have seen in the GP Supervisor series that we've got tonight, Introduction to GP Supervision. Clinical Reasoning Game is next week. Then we're looking at Planning Learning at the end of July, Informal Teaching, Managing Uncertainty, Consultation, Analysis and Feedback, Formal Teaching, and rounding out the year with Professionalism.
Glenn, thank you very much, and a very warm welcome from me. As Glenn said, my name's Simon Morgan. I'm a GP here in Newcastle, joining you tonight from Wabble country, just south of the Hunter River in the Hunter Valley, as is Tony Solstice, my long-term friend and colleague, and he and I will be presenting tonight on very much an overview, an introduction to GP supervision. And as Glenn said, this is the first webinar in a series that GPSA have conceived to support the orientation and induction and training that GP supervisors have through their regional training organisations, really to complement that, that skill development they've had, hopefully broadening those skills and knowledge, giving them a bit more confidence, and maybe touching on some areas that weren't covered in their own induction processes. We're aware that there'll be new supervisors, maybe some who have never had a registrar under their wing. There'll be some people who maybe have just started, and others who may have quite a bit of experience and just come along to hear what's to be said. And so welcome all. It's a great pleasure to have you on tonight. And we really hope this will be, as I say, one of now a series of webinars to round out that the kind of core areas that we'd like to see a new supervisor to the role come away with. So tonight, as I say, very much an overview, the core roles and responsibilities of the GP supervisor, challenges and conflicts in the role, and that's the roles and responsibilities. And there's a picture of a gift, a reward perhaps, on the opening slide. And we really do wish to enthuse you to harness the sort of passion and the skills and the interest and the reasons that you've taken on this role as supervisors to become as excellent a supervisor of registrars as you can be. And of course, you know, we can't and you shouldn't underestimate the extraordinary influence that you have on learners in the practice. I'm sure you will have heard tales of registrars having progressed through training, talking about their mentors, talking about the supervisors that supported them in the practice. And it's such a privilege and such a wonderful opportunity. And really, Tony and I are here very much to say, fantastic that you're part of this. It's such a wonderful role. And with the right knowledge and skills, you can make it hugely rewarding for the registrar as well. So let's get started. So a few basics. I guess it's interesting to think about the apprenticeship model in Australian general practice training. You might think, well, of course, that's the way it is. That's the way it is everywhere. But it's not actually. It is the foundation here, this notion of a registrar training in the practice setting, learning on the job under the supervision of an accredited trainer or supervisor, as it is in the UK and Ireland and New Zealand and the Netherlands, but not everywhere is that model the same. So I think as medical educators work in that environment, we're actually pretty happy that is the model we take here, very much with a focus on sort of patient safety. And there's a cartoon. I'm hoping there's a small chuckle about what it's going to portray here, but it is actually incorrect. It's a wrong example of what happens in practice, in that Superman's apprentice isn't ironing his cape on day one. He's actually seeing Superman's patients behind a closed door often. And so this notion of being available and accessible and supportive and skilled for your registrar from day one is such an important aspect of what we are wanting to talk about tonight. And of course, there's a whole range of knowledge, skills and attitudes, which we will kind of explore as we go through the webinar this evening. And again, this may or may not be a sort of schematic representation of supervision that you're aware of. Supervision, broadly speaking, is this sort of oversight of somebody's performance. But in at least in the case of supervision of a registrar in the practice setting, we can conceive of supervision as having these two parts. Clinical supervision, is the patient safe? And educational supervision, is the registrar, is the learner learning? And of course, they overlap, and they overlap to varying degrees according to the registrar, according to the supervisor, according to the practice setting, a whole range of things, and indeed even the practice method or the case that's being discussed, whether it's primarily about patient safety or it's primarily about registrar learning. But of course, in many instances, it's both. And so to tease those two sort of circles out, clinical supervision refers to this sort of clinical oversight. And that's a term I really like, and one hopefully you've been introduced to, thinking about quality of care and patient safety. And I'm hoping that your host RTOs have talked to you about a so-called clinical supervision plan, because for me, that's very much the direct practical application of clinical supervision. This is something that you can do on the back of an envelope, or you can do in a really formal way using a tool that maybe the RTO has given you to tease out these really important elements of how you will provide clinical supervision, which, as I say, there is patient safety and quality of care while you're registraring in the practice. And that's talking about how ad hoc supervision will occur. How will you be contacted? A knock on the door, an electronic message, a phone call. What about scheduling end of session discussion? When will that happen? How will that occur? When will formative assessments, looking at performance, random case analysis and direct observation, those sorts of things occur in the practice? So really kind of mapping this out so it's formalized is so important. And the reason is, and again, another cartoon, in those 4 out of 5 doctors commercials, I'm the 5th doctor, we know occasionally that registrars can be this 5th doctor, and fortunately it's not 20%, it's more like 1.5%. But there are registrars out there who may have, really significant professionalism issues or clinical knowledge gaps or real areas of concern. But while they're practicing behind a closed door, kind of getting on with their day, without clinical oversight, without a mechanism of opening that door and seeing what's happening, very often they can be missed. So that's the clinical supervision element. And then there's educational supervision. And this is very much around, is the registrar learning? And there's an expectation that you guide the registrar's educational development through, and we had a long discussion about this in another guise today, Tony and I, and that in terms of learning plans, and that's a term you'll be familiar with. We're both not huge fans of learning plans per se, though we strongly support supervisors early on and in an ongoing way to help the registrar plan their learning. If that involves a written or other type of learning plan, great. But it's much more around early identification of learning needs, how formal and informal teaching will occur in the practice, and obviously provision of feedback and when that occurs in practice. And again, I haven't, as I say, I've worked with Tony for a very long time, and he said something really wise today, and that's that a raised eyebrow, an ignoring of a question, a curt response, or indeed a comprehensive discussion of a registrar's performance are all feedback. And so when we talk about feedback, and Tony may elaborate on that, it is a much broader thing than this very formal, almost rigid process that often supervisors are taught to deliver. Clearly that embraces some of that, but there's other elements. So feedback's that ongoing part of your relationship with a registrar. And really, if I get to what I think is the best definition, here it is. A GP supervisor is a general practitioner who establishes and maintains an educational alliance that supports the clinical, we've talked about clinical supervision, educational, we've talked about learning, and personal development of resident. And very pleased to say that was written by a colleague, Susan Wern, who many of you may know, an Australian, well, she's actually UK born, but Australian GP, in this very nice paper that was published in Medical Education. And really, when we think about supervision, then I think there's that third element, and we can't get away from that incredibly important aspect of the way we support registrars around their personal development and personal support. I'm almost through the kind of global scene-setting stuff. Before we get into a bit of a discussion, I just like this summary paper. It's 23 years old now, but I'm not sure the findings would be hugely different if we surveyed GP registrars and supervisors. Now, what are the key attributes? Honesty, and I think honesty also means comfort and regularity of honest, fearless feedback, availability and accessibility, good communication skills, clinically competent, and obviously committed, enthusiastic, passionate about their teaching. What a great summary that is of what the attributes are to be a good supervisor. All right, so Jared Ingham, who we also spent some time with today, and many of you may know, is a supervisor and a medical educator down in Dalesford. He talks about, it's his line, not mine, but a workshop is where you guys do the work and we get to go shopping. We're not going to disappear anywhere. In fact, we're going to join you in these small groups, but we're going to have two small groups tonight. We figured a cohort of new supervisors, so much of this really warrants a little bit of discussion between you, sharing some war stories, opening up about your uncertainties and discomforts. So we're going to have two 8-minute sessions tonight. We're going to, Jane will seamlessly break us up into small groups. And this first activity for you guys to think about is two questions. When you start your supervision with a new registrar in the practice, what do they want from you? What is the expectation of what they actually want you to do with them? But much more broadly, and I guess this sort of expands the roles, what does your registrar need from you? And that they can overlap, sometimes for two very different things. So for about 8 minutes, we'll discuss those in our groups. And I'm hoping that was a productive little discussion. We had a representative from every state. Glenn, you'll be pleased to hear, except for Tasmania. So that was pretty good. And the territory. And we just covered some wonderful ground around cultural needs, around just that notion of being available and provision of support, exam prep. And that I really like this term around that one of our supervisors talked about needing a little bit of mothering and cushioning that blow from the hospital environment into general practice. That's, I think, why it's so, and the other thing was, it's just so nice to see faces when these webinars are so often done into the ether. It's just lovely to see our supervisor members here. But that notion of, catching them, cushioning their fall or cushioning their arrival into general practice, such a lovely thing that I've certainly never thought about in those terms. I'm just going to summarise this area really quickly and then hand over to Tony. And really, in a way, thinking about the wants and the needs and how they overlap, but they're also quite different. So we observe as educators, as supervisors, that the registrar's wants are often very clinical. They want to know how to diagnose that rash. Why is this thing called a herald patch, and why is it's in a Christmas tree distribution, and why we can just sit tight for 6 or 8 weeks and pityriasis rosea disappears. They want management advice. They want to know how to do GPMPs and mental health care plans. They want to know how to prescribe and order tests and which orthopaedic specialist to refer to, all of which is absolutely valid and important. But in a sense, when we think about what we can offer as supervisors, I reckon we'd do really well to see the knowledge acquisition as clearly hugely important, but something registrars can do from ETG or MIRTA or from other guidelines, and we can help them in some respects. But so much of what our role can be is broader than that, and that's the skills. So I know this is RACGP centric as opposed to ACRM, so apologies for that, but just to think beyond the clinical, thinking about those other domains of practice, which are, I think, flowing into the needs. So registrars want a whole bunch of stuff, and these needs are the unknown unknowns. They're not aware that they really need to be able to do these things as well, but it's our job, I think, to broaden our teaching, to broaden our supervision and our scope beyond the clinical to think of these other aspects. So I've asterisked the headings of the webinars that are coming up. So if you've got a particular interest in clinical reasoning, next week you will have fun learning about this in the clinical reasoning game. So clinical reasoning, and when I talk about clinical reasoning, what I usually do to start is to say when I was a medical student, certainly a GP registrar, I don't remember ever hearing this term clinical reasoning as part of my training. And now it's all that registrars talk about because it's the basis of the KFP exam, and it's such a critical skill for registrars to learn and supervisors to support. So there's a webinar on that. There's no asterisks. We're not talking about communication skills directly as part of this webinar series, but clearly supporting registrars' communication skills with patients. This incredibly and fundamental approach to managing and looking after patients in Australian general practice around patient-centred care, how to truly see the world through the patient's eyes, how to truly share decisions with your patients, a skill that I would so strongly encourage you guys to foster in your registrars when you're doing all the teaching stuff with them. We're doing a session on professionalism. This is one of my favourite cartoons with the big Q, with the Doctors Without Boundaries, and how we can identify professionalism issues and support professional and ethical practice in our registrars. So again, a registrar often won't see this as a want. They won't want this stuff from us as supervisors and educators, but absolutely they need it, or most need it to some degree and some need it to a significant degree. Organisational skills, we've talked a bit about some of those organisational aspects of practice, but that's a key aspect. The consultation, we're dedicating a webinar session to unpacking the consultation and those core skills of, as basic as history taking and physical examination and data synthesis and imparting a diagnosis and explanation and safety netting and all those sorts of things. We're doing a session on uncertainty. And again, if you're interested in this aspect of practice, Justin Coleman will be talking about this in a couple of months. As some of the supervisors in my small group talked about, what a different environment it is. This is a picture of a swamp, and very often general practice is referred to as the swamp because it's messy and it's hard to navigate compared to the much neater, cleaner environment of the hospital. Reflective practice, how we can encourage our registrars to truly reflect on practice. And I think that's often paid lip service to, but it's an important aspect of what we can do in our supervision role. And this is my last slide before I hand over to Tony. And it's really just a bit of a sense of these 4 aspects of influence that where a practitioner operates. So how they reason, including the clinical and the consultation and the uncertainty stuff, how they form relationships, which is the patient-centered care and the communication, how they reflect, which is to themselves, and how they respond more broadly to the wider world, to the health system, to medical legal side of things. So that's just a way of thinking about that much broader approach to skill development in our registrars than simply the clinical. And I'll hand over to Tony. Thanks, Tony.
Hi, everybody. Tony Soltis, as was mentioned, GP and long-time involvement in GP supervisor education. Look, Simon talked about these 4 skills that your GP registrar needs to learn, and I think that then rolls into, well, what does that mean about your roles as a GP supervisor? And you wear many hats as a GP supervisor to be able to address these skills in your registrar. I guess the most obvious one is that, as has been mentioned, is that you are involved in the registrar's teaching and helping them to learn. And there is a GPSA session on this, I think next month, the end of next month, I think July 29 might be the date that I remember seeing. And clearly this is the role that you probably all think of first and foremost. You need to be a teacher and you need to help them learn to become a better GP. And certainly that's the most obvious, the hat that you wear. In addition to being a teacher, you are also a mentor. And I don't know how many of you know your Greek mythology. Mentor was assigned to look after the son of Odysseus. Telemachus is the tall, good-looking bloke on the left. And when Odysseus was away on his many travels, Mentor was asked to look after him. And as a mentor, isn't just a teacher. A mentor is a guide. And I guess the mentor shares wisdom and experience that a younger, more inexperienced person can learn from. So you are a mentor, even when you don't even know you're doing it. You're a mentor. And I guess closely aligned to this is that you are, whether you like it or not, you're a role model, just as Jodie is here being the first female Doctor Who. She's a role model for female actors. So you're a role model, whether you like it or not, and consciously or otherwise, your registrars are constantly watching what you do and how you do it. Not just the clinical stuff. They're aware of your attitudes to patients and to staff and to medicine in general. They're aware of your clinical, your professional, and your interpersonal behaviour, which are on display constantly. And they're quite a strong influence on your registrar. So that's something that you just, by virtue of being in the practice together with them, you are role modelling a lot for them. Simon's already mentioned this in terms of the third aspect of being supervisor, but you are necessarily a pastoral carer. In other words, looking after the welfare of your registrars. And while obviously your role would be inappropriate to be your registrar's GP or their counsellor, they need your support to cope with the anxieties and stresses of being a GP registrar, which I'm sure you can remember from back when you started in general practice. And they may also be dealing with other life issues that could impact on their experience at work, family issues, isolation from friends and family. So this is an incredibly important role that you take, and I guess you're used to doing this with your patients, caring about them. It's a role that you'd have with your registrars as well. Now, just like the busy bee in the middle of that picture marked with red, you are absolutely an organiser as well. Organising in lots of different ways. You've got to keep the rest of your practice on board with what the registrar needs for their training and learning, keeping them all acting in sync. You need to sort your own scheduling out, your own time management to be able to be available for when the registrar needs you. And these are all parts of your role as an organiser. It's probably worth just acknowledging, though, that the admin requirements of training in this part of the role can be sometimes onerous and unsatisfying. And I guess like all the paperwork we do in general practice, it can be time consuming and of course is usually unpaid. And look, although it's hard to see the point of some of it, there are some unavoidable necessities like having to renew accreditation or get paid for your teaching or reporting back about your trainees' progress. So look, it's acknowledge that this paperwork, the admin side of this job can be a bit of a bugbear, but it basically doesn't outweigh the other considerable satisfactions you get from being a supervisor. But we know it happens. Now, some of you will be practice owners, and so therefore you will be the registrar's employer. I'm hoping someone a little bit more kind and person-centred than Monty Burns here. But look, even if you're not an actual employer of the registrar, you know, or you may be a contractor or an employee, you may still have a role having to represent the interests of the practice as well. And finally, you are necessarily an assessor. Most of the assessment, as Simon has mentioned before, that you'd be doing with your registrar is about helping them to learn what they need to learn and what they need to learn to improve. But in addition to those kind of day-to-day assessments, your training organisation might ask you to assess their performance more formally, perhaps for the purpose of determining their progress through training. So that's a little bit more of a daunting role that you may be asked to fulfil. So look, I've really just listed some of the roles of important roles of being a GP supervisor, and there are many GPSA sessions to come that will explore some of those roles much more thoroughly and practically. But look, clearly being a supervisor can be a complex business. If you're lucky enough to get a registrar who's advanced, very competent and basically happy in life, it can be a very easy job. But it can be more challenging if the registrar is new to general practice and has a lot to learn, or particularly if they're one of the small percentage that are really struggling to perform in some way or another. And of course, registrars can struggle to perform in a number of different ways. Of course, they may struggle because their clinical knowledge just isn't up to scratch and they're struggling to diagnose and manage their patients. But it may be that just their decision-making or even their clinical reasoning skills are below par. They may be having real problems with communication skills, which may be affecting their interaction with their patients. Time management, as you know, can be an issue for all of us, even it is for me, even after 30 years in general practice. But registrars, particularly early registrars, can really struggle with time management, and it can create stress for you and for the registrar. Billing issues can be a problem, and as a business trying to make money, if your registrar is not billing well, that can be a problem for you. Obviously, registrars might not be performing in terms of their interpersonal skills with their patients, most importantly, but equally with staff and colleagues, and that may create tensions in the practice. And as been also mentioned, Simon's also mentioned before, aspects of professionalism can be a challenge for certain registrars and can really affect their performance as a GP. So what we're going to do is have a look at another activity in a second. I guess the reason these kind of registrars with problems may be challenging is because as a supervisor, you've really got to bring all your abilities and skills to play to deal with this. But the other way in which this can be challenging is that your roles as a GP can actually come into conflict with each other. And if you think about the roles we've talked about so far, we're going to just have a little discussion in our groups again. And this is what I'd like you to do is just discuss this scenario. And the scenario is simply that, look, as your training organisation requires you halfway through the term to provide a progress report on your term 3 registrar. But you've observed that your registrar's time management is poor and they're frequently running over an hour late. And you've been asked to submit a mid-term report to your training organisation about this. What I'd like you to discuss in your groups is a couple of things. What role conflicts of the roles we've mentioned does this bring up for you? This scenario bring up for you, and how might you kind of manage and balance these conflicts? And while you're there in your group, you might also think about other possible role conflicts between the roles we've mentioned that there might be for you as a GP supervisor. So 2 questions: what role conflicts does this particular scenario bring up for you, having to assess your registrar and report on them? And what other possible role conflicts can you imagine or have you experienced even as a GP supervisor? So we'll break into our groups for another 6 or 7 minutes, and we'll come back and have a quick chat. That was a great little discussion then. Actually, I don't know how others went, but we heard some very good discussion about role conflicts. Clearly, this scenario, the thing that most people picked up on was the necessity to balance your responsibility to the profession and to the training organisation to report honestly and fearlessly about this poorly performing registrar versus your very important role as both a mentor and a pastoral carer for this same person. So you're looking after their feelings and their confidence at the same time as, you know, selling them down the drain, you might feel like. But in fact, you have a very important role as an assessor to be doing that. Some of you also recognise the possible conflict of having to assess somebody as not performing well and possibly having implications on whether they stay in the practice or not, versus an employer that actually wants to keep a registrar in with them. And look, some other role conflicts that possibly came up included the role conflict of perhaps advocating for your registrar to not be too busy and not have so many patients to see, versus the fact that your practice is busy and needs bums on seats to function. So there are many other role models which we could spend an hour discussing. It's a fascinating discussion on how we try to balance our different roles. I think one of the nicest answers I heard was talking about the balancing the role model, particularly being a role model, and how we do that when we're all imperfect. And one of the best answers I've heard was what we do as role models is to demonstrate how we deal with our imperfection and demonstrate how we sit comfortably with our lack of perfection. I thought it was a great answer. Okay. Look, I guess in terms of the skills and just a taste of the kind of things that as a supervisor you can do for a registrar that's perhaps struggling, there's a lot of things that you can do and that you'll learn to do through subsequent sessions. First of all, obviously accurately assessing what's going on in other words, diagnosing by direct observation or random case analysis, looking at what they've done already. We talked about role modelling, that by role modelling your own consultations, your own interpersonal skills and your own professional traits, the registrar picks up on that. Involving the broader practice team, so whether that involves other medical colleagues or practice nurse or practice manager to help with improving the registrar's performance. And of course, there's always help available from either your training organisation or medical educator. Obviously, ultimately, your teaching, your medical teaching can make an enormous difference to how a registrar performs. I guess at this point, it's worth mentioning that, look, it sounds like supervision can be difficult. It can be complicated at times, and it can be tricky with some registrars. I guess it's worth saying that probably the best rewards you'll get from supervision, though, are when you can actually make a positive difference to some of these learners. And it is one of the most satisfying aspects of the work. But look, I don't want this to be sounding daunting, because really, whether you're a new supervisor or you've been doing it for a while, you'll recognise that a lot of what you do as a supervisor parallels very closely what you do as a GP. First of all, and most importantly, you take a care and an interest in your patient or your registrar. And that is, without paying attention and taking interest in your registrar as you do with your patient, you won't have a relationship and you won't effectively teach. Obviously, as a GP, you assess what needs improving or fixing. You order investigations, so in other words, assessing the registrar's learning. You obviously have a key role and you're very good at advising and educating patients, as you will be with your registrars. And you learn that the patient or the learner needs to be at the centre of their own management. They need to have their own responsibility for managing themselves. So a lot of these skills, a lot of these attributes are things that you already can do. If you were going to tease out, though, that the three things that you could work on and that over subsequent supervisor professional development sessions you will get better at, probably three things that stand out are making the most of those ad hoc teaching moments, the corridor consultation or the phone advice, how to turn those into valuable pearls of teaching in a minute or two. Very importantly, learning how to make really full use of cases in teaching, but not only in teaching, but also in assessing your registrar. And random case analysis is the example par excellence of a way of managing cases, of dealing with cases for teaching and assessment. And learning that is an incredibly important skill. And thirdly, and very importantly, how do you usefully either reinforce or correct what your registrar is doing? In other words, how do you give good quality feedback? Now, these are skills that you have already to some degree, and you'll develop with, as I said, supervisor professional development sessions provided by GPSA and hopefully by your training organisation as well. I guess that the message I would just like to leave you with is, look, supervising is an incredibly complex but very satisfying part of your work as a GP, and ultimately a very fulfilling part of it. So I'd like to thank all of you for being involved with your registrars and for hopefully improving the quality and safety of general practice, and wish you all the best. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tony. That's a great way to finish, I think. And I must say, Tony and I have run lots and lots more than I care to think about, actually, supervisor professional development workshops over the years. And my stock standard line would be something in the order of, as a medical educator, I think we often feel we do fashion a registrar's progress through training in the external workshop teaching program that we run. We get them into a room together, we give them a lecture, we do small groups, we talk about some of these issues, and we leave, they leave, and it all feels really good, like we've made a huge impact. But, that's a really, really small part of their overall exposure and experience. And it's really you guys, the supervisors, in this apprenticeship model, in the practice setting, learning by seeing patients, that is the richest aspect of their training and their learning. And so I would make that same gesture and say thank you very much for giving so much to the next cohort of Australian GPs. And it is hard. There are lots of responsibilities. Tony alluded to the extended paperwork. There are lots of roles, and I guess we unashamedly sort of wanted to pitch this first webinar in this series just to give that really broad sense of, the conflicts that can arise in this really challenging role as GP supervisor, how to tease some of those out, and some of those aspects of what you actually do and what the registrar wants from you. But there are rewards, and I mean, I think we've had supervisors in the groups of 20 years standing and some who are just very new, and I'm hoping that even those who are longer in the tooth are still finding the rewards of the role. So in terms of references, wow, you can't go past the GPSA educational suite of references. There'll be links to these in the feedback email afterwards. But if you haven't availed yourselves of the now dozen or so GPSA guides on some of these core educational topics, have a look. There's over 100 clinical and consultation skill teaching plans now that are basically off-the-shelf teaching resources for use in the practice. We're fully aware that registrars are increasingly just picking these up themselves and using them for independent study, which is so gratifying. And of course, webinars like this, there's a whole library of previous webinars, and of course, there's the ones that are coming in this series. As always, we'd like to thank the support and funding from the AGPT for supporting GPSA to run educational events like this.
Thanks very much, Simon and Tony. That was good fun. Even the breakout groups I found a lot of fun as well. So thank you all for participating. We didn't have a great deal in terms of questions. I think we moved through reasonably quickly. There was a comment about the amount of administration associated with being a supervisor, and there is no doubt that there is plenty of that. That's exactly why GPSA exists, to make the jobs of GP supervisors that little bit easier. So the resources that have been created have been designed exactly for that, to make things like in practice teaching things like supervision discussions with a registrar at risk, some pro forma documents that you can plug and play, grab off the shelf, etc. Now, the documents, the resources that Simon showed you there are all able to be downloaded. You don't have to purchase them. You can purchase hard copies if you would like, but they're at cost as well. So you've got an opportunity to support what you're doing with your registrars there, but easily downloadable onto your resources, onto your computers. Thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for, Simon and Tony. I don't actually have any other questions for you, so thanks very much.
Thanks, guys, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. And if you know of anyone who's interested in the series, obviously let them know.